Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be looking at an introduction to cell calculation. Today's webinar is an intermediate webinar, so it's for those of you who have a knowledge of Caseware. We're just going to look at cell calculation in different areas of the template. Now, my name is Phil Reeves, and today our presenter is going to be Anthony Launchbury, who's one of our education and media consultants. Now, before we start the webinar, just going to run through one or two housekeeping elements. Now, today we're going to be using the hand raising feature. So what I want you all to do is just have a go at raising, just use the hand raising option just to raise your hand so we can make sure that that's working okay. It should be on your go to webinar panel on the right hand side. If you've got any questions at all during the webinar, you can raise your hand or you can put it in the question field if you don't want to ask the question live. We're looking to incorporate some live questions into today's webinar. So there'll be different areas during the webinar where you'll have the chance to ask a question live to either myself or Anthony. So without further ado, what I'll do is I'll pass over to Tony to start the webinar.
Thanks for the introduction there, Phil. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. As Phil said there, this is kind of aimed at not new Caseware users, but definitely intermediate people with some experience on the template and so on. This is an introduction to those cells, so it's really just going to give a briefing of what we can do and what we can't do within a template, and give you a little bit of knowledge regarding things like cell types and what cell types we can use with certain calculations and different formula types. We also look at standard functionality. So how do we change calculations within the standard AccountsAdvanced template? So when we're looking at FRS 101, 102, even IFRS, it's got the same kind of methodology there. So where we can use the functionality from the toolbar just to create some custom calculations. Then we're going to be looking at the custom calculations completely, custom cell calculations, where we can use these. Now, one of the things we kind of want to gauge from you is where you want to be using these type of cell calculations. I'd imagine most of you that signed up for the webinar have already thought about, okay, where could we use cell calculations to improve automation, or you've already tried to prepare something before but haven't quite got there. So I just want to get an idea of what direction you want the webinar to go into, what areas you want us to cover. So Phil, could you raise the poll for me, please?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Tony. So we've got a quick poll for everyone today, and essentially that should be launching on your screen now. And all we want to know is in which areas of the financial statements would you most benefit from custom calculations? So would that be the director's report and strategic report? Would that be within the audit report, the notes to the financial statements, or the accounting policies? So I'm just going to give you a moment to provide an answer on there. And the responses that you can give, as well as driving this webinar, can also very much drive our advanced level webinar that we're going to be following up on, this with in a couple of weeks. Okay, so I'll just give you another couple of seconds. There we go, just close this poll. And if I share the results, as you can see, Tony, it's an overwhelming majority for the notes to the financial statements.
Notes to the financial statements, brilliant, excellent. So as Phil mentioned there, we want to make sure that we're driving this towards what you want to see. The notes to the financial statements, we kind of, again, get some ideas of what you want us to prepare. So as Phil said there and alluded to, we have got an advanced webinar playing on the same topic. So it'd be really nice to have a few ideas from you to see exactly what you want us to build and show you how to do within that webinar so you can get full benefit from it. So for the ones of you that went through and put in for notes to the accounts, can you put a few ideas of what you'd want us to cover within the question field? So again, a particular style of note or certain content or information from the trial balance, or additional information but maybe doesn't live on the trial balance, like staff numbers which we populate through the wizard, but maybe there's other areas like that that you want us to include. So pop some ideas down in the question field, and I will build those into the next webinar to make sure that we are focusing on that content and driving it back from there. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much today, guys. What we'll do now is just going to move on to a quick introduction to cell types. Okay, the reason being is because really, until you know what the cell types are available, it's hard to know what kind of calculations we can build. So that's the first thing, really. Now, there are more cell types than what you can see on the screen: alphanumeric, numeric, date, and checkbox. These are the ones we're going to be predominantly focusing on for this webinar and the next webinar. Unless one of your ideas comes into the question field that maybe needs to use a different cell type. There are cell types like radio buttons that can be really useful as well, which depending on what kind of content you want to see or you want to drive, then that all depends what we show. Okay, but the main ones really are always going to be the alphanumeric or numeric. They're always the ones that we need to look at. If you're looking at, say, custom reports, so strategic report, director's report, audit reports, the date one also is very useful for populating year ends. And that as well goes alongside with the checkbox. With things like reports, there'll be maybe with a standard report you create, there's bodies of text in it that don't apply to all clients. So what you can do is have checkboxes to either show or hide content. All very useful, but what we'll try and do is give you some examples of that, all of those within today's webinar, and go in a little bit more depth into the next one. So just to show you a little bit more about the cell types, we created a quick case view document, a very basic case view document with those 4 cell types on. So we've got numeric, alphanumeric, date, and checkbox. Now just to populate, just so you can see, if you to click on this cell, you can see the blue outline on that box there, and the same with Elstrom, same with the year end there. That blue outline there kind of represents a cell, so you would have more likely clicked into a body of text within the director's report or within the accounts, and you would have seen this little blue box. That's what a cell is. Okay, so that identifies that we're working with a cell. Now, with the checkbox here, this is what I was referring to, as you can use it to show or hide items. You can tick the box to show something or remove the tick to hide something. So it's very useful within, say, custom bodies text that you want to hide certain elements depending on if it's required or if it's not required. All these up here, so numeric, Elstrom, year end, these are all populated by databases. Okay, so we're going to go into these more and more detail as we go through the webinar. These are very, very basic. If I went into, say, view and design mode quickly, what you'll see here is if I double click or just select the cell, we have a calculation up here. So this is looking ACT, YR0, and then net inc. So YR0 is the current year, net inc is your profit loss. If I change that YR0 to YR1, it would look at the prior year profit and loss figure rather than the current year. Alphanumeric, when we go down here, we can see it's populated with CLP2. This is a database identifier. We use these within the engagement property screener throughout working papers, Caseware working papers, and again, it allows us static points to drive information. So there'll be lots of different CLP references we can use to drive contact details, engagement properties such as addresses and so on. As we'll go into this a little bit more depth as we go through. Date side, again, this can also be a database reference. As most of you will know, because you've all set up files in Caseware, if you go through to engagement properties, you have got a report dates over here, and this will be my year end. If I was to change this year end here, because I've linked it to the database over here, CLP13, that will automatically update. Okay. Again, also if I change this to a prior year one, so CLP62, it also changes the prior year. Okay. Checkbox is very, very simple. It's either a 1 or a 0. So if it's got a tick in the box, it'll be a 1 or a 0 and vice versa. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to use these throughout this webinar and the next webinar, just show you how much more detail we can drive. Now, alphanumeric is quite a useful one for when we're using if formulas. In Caseware, like Excel, we can use if formulas to drive smart text. And you can obviously build ifs within an if statement and looking at logic or information that's already supplied within the wizard that can drive certain information or detail within disclosures. So very useful. So we're not going to touch if statements within this webinar, but if that's something you want to consider, how we can automate text within disclosures, especially for custom notes, text notes within notes to financial statements, then we could use if statements to drive that really effectively. So again, If that kind of goes along the lines of what you want to see, then put your example in the questions field and we'll try and build that in to the next webinar to show you how that would work. Okay. All right, so that was a quick introduction to the different cell types. As I did say, there are more cell types, and if I was to go Control and L here, that's the shortcut for creating a new cell. You'll see when I go to create cell, these are all the cell types we've got available to us. So alphanumeric, date, checkbox, radio button, and button. These two at the bottom would be less commonly used, but they're still got very powerful purposes and very efficient if we need to use them for certain tasks. Okay, but these are the ones we're going to focus on today. All right, so that was the introduction to cell types. Before we get on, if anyone has got any questions, and obviously you want to ask those now about cell types, feel free just to raise your hand. I'll give you 30 seconds or so just to raise your hand, and if you want to ask a question, we'll just answer that now before we move on. So no hands raised, Phil?
I'm just giving everyone a second. Doesn't look like we've got any questions at this stage.
Perfect. Okay, brilliant. So moving on then, let's turn the slide the right way. Standard functionality within AccountsAdvanced demonstration. Okay, so for this part then we have, as you saw there, got a Caseware file open. So I'll just jump back into this file. And there we go, that should be shown on the screen now. We've set this up with a couple of bits today. So webinar example notes, looking at mapping and something called a wildcard. For the advanced kind of Excel users, used to using lots of search options within Excel, you're probably aware of wildcards within Excel and how you can use those within the search parameters. You can also use those within Caseware. So you can use question marks and asterisks to drive information within notes. I'm going to give you an example of that as we move through. Before we do though, I just want to show you how looking at the row population, the debtors note and so on up here, what we can do there is we can look at the calculations here. So just the standard functionality within AccountsAdvanced. When we do this though, the first thing we do, and it's one of the tricks that always used to catch me out, was to not show the skipped rows. Okay, so the first thing you should do here when you're trying to look at a row or look at a note and the calculations, just show the skipped rows. Because what that will do is it will change the functionality or the options on your toolbar. As you probably just saw there, that this button's become activated. So this button here will show me the custom calculation that we use for trade debtors. Now, not each and every one of these rows uses a custom calculation. So you can see here for amounts owed by group undertakings, there's no calculation button here. So what you can do in those cases is just go straight to row configuration. If it's not a custom calculation, it's only going to be populated by two other means automatically, which will be a note and an individual map number. Okay, so custom calculations use map numbers, but it just allows us to use multiple map numbers and wildcards, whereas map number here just allows us to select a map level, so map level 1, 2, 3, or 4, but it won't allow you to add multiple together. Okay, now closing out this quickly, and we'll go back into our trade debtors over here and click on cell calculation. It looks very similar. I showed you one earlier, obviously within that example document, which was ACT. It started off with ACT and it had a slightly different start here. Mine had YR0, whereas it says CY. But you can use both within Caseware. CY or Y0 will do exactly the same. But if I open this up in the expression editor, to make it a little bit, calculation editor, you can see here that these are the map numbers. Now, in this part here, what's really useful to see, as again, most of you would have picked up on this before, is very often when you view Caseware's calculations, you're going to see wildcards. So these question marks, what those question marks relate to is to say, okay, well, we're going to be looking at this set map number. So it has to start with CO2 and then 01, and it has to end with a 0 and a question mark. So basically what it's looking is these question marks say any variation. So any variation of any map number with exactly the same start here and the same finish. It doesn't matter what this third section is. And the same for the last one here. So it can be exactly the same as the rest of it, including these question marks, but this last section could be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Now, there are other ones we can also look at when we're looking at wildcards. These are question marks, but we can also use asterisks. Asterisks are a lot quicker just to look at every variation. So for example, if I was to go down to my mapping row here, if I want this to be, I just want this to look at, say, all additions. So if I go through and I'm going to change this row here to look at additions. Now I'm not going to, I don't want to say what additions, or whether it's motor vehicles or plant machinery. I just want it to look at all additions. Now in here, what we can do is we can select the map number for additions here and select OK. And obviously this 04 defines that it's looking at simply at plant machinery. If I press OK there and we change that to a question mark, then you can see here that the calculation hasn't changed because there are no other additions in this file. If I press OK here, and I was going to go back and slightly fudge my trial balance just to show you this figure updating. So let's go back here and we'll go to trial balance quickly. Again, we'll just go through and change. There we go. Terrible adjustment, but you'll see the idea. So we'll change that to a motor vehicles additions. And then as we go back, you obviously, because you've got the creditor, it's going to change. Give that a second to load through and recalculate. There we go. So now we can see, because I linked it to a credit rather than a debit, it's reduced 105,000 to 84,833. And the reason it's done that is because when we set the calculation up, it's looking at any variation. So what it wants is to start off with A01, and it wants to finish with these two last sections. But this middle section here, well, we can have any variation of that, say, fourth, fifth character. Okay. So that's the way that those wildcards work. Now, what we can do with the asterisks, so when we're looking at asterisk wildcards, well, maybe we want to look at something slightly different. Maybe we just want to look at all of admin costs. So we want to look at all of the admin costs on the P&L. So what we can do here is, rather than using the map numbers and tirelessly going through and going down to our R section and selecting all of our R's here, what we can do instead is simply we could add this one here and use that as a basis, as a starting point, and then just go through and change this. So, well, I don't want to add individual map numbers together. So I can just go down here and leave it as R and put an asterisk at the end of it. You can see as soon as I do that, it populates with 2591 39653. Okay, so what it's looking at is any variation. Now, rather than going through and doing exactly the same modification for the prior year, what we can just do is highlight that. You can use Control and C on your keyboard to copy, and then Control and V to paste. You've also got the option here to right click and paste and copy if you want to use right clicking instead of the keyboard commands. But at stage then, all we need to do is change YR0 to YR1, and as soon as I do that, you can see that now populates the prior year. And you can do exactly the same thing for that additions row above. So once this loads, I can go back to that additions, go to cell calculation, and do exactly the same thing here. So we set the calculation up as I want, but I just want to change that to the prior year. So change YR0 to YR1. Or alternatively, if you want to go through the individual calculations again, you can come back to this screen and add these together and subtract them. So it's very easy to add to the formula. You can see that's now added to the bottom, and then obviously to remove with the minus key. So this functionality here has been set up it's quite easy to manage. Now, what I would say is that probably the only thing here that we need to be careful of is that these are consistent. So you can see at the top one here to the one the prior year are completely different. So obviously this will make no sense as we move forward. So just be careful when we're looking at these to make sure the top calculation is the same as the bottom. That's why I quite like copying the top one, and then we can go over here, we can paste that in, and then just change YR0 to YR1. Okay. All right, so that is looking at the standard functionality within the template. Now, see, there's more we can do here, but before we move on, before we go through and cover too much, I just want to see if there's any questions regarding that functionality within the template. So, Phil, have we had any questions come in during that?
No, we haven't had any questions in the question field. Just if anyone wants to jot a question down or raise their hand to ask a live question, I will just give you a second to do that.
Obviously, don't feel any pressure. You don't have to ask a question. Or if you just want to put in a question field and come back to us later, then it's no problem either. So I'll give you a couple more moments there. I'm assuming at this stage no one wants to ask questions, so that's okay. Hopefully that just means it's nice and everyone understood that well. So we'll move on. Okay, so custom cell calculations. So where could we be using this? Now, what I'm going to show you now is you can adopt to anywhere within the accounts. So you can adopt this within text notes or again anywhere within the accounts. It's the same methodology, the same functions that we're going to be using. To make it nice and clear and easy, I'm just going to scoot up to the director's report within the file. So results and dividends, just because it's a nice visual, easy to see why we're doing it and what we can do. Okay, so first things first is this body of text here from Caseware. It's automated. Okay, so I know this is a blue input cell and we can overtype it just by clicking in the box, but profit there, that is based upon these figures. So if this figure is a loss, then it would be saying loss, okay? And for the year, okay, well, that's also linked to the wizard. Within the wizard, you'll know there's an option to say whether it's for the year or for the period ended. So if we say it's for the period ended 9th of December, then it would change it to period here after taxation amounted to 761,739. And in the prior year 162. So what we can do is when we set up our own text notes or sections within the director's report or audit report or trustees report or anything along those lines, we can go through and automate the text. Okay, now we'll start off just by copying that text and I'm just going to place that within a row and also being mindful of what time we've got as well. So we've got about 10 minutes to go through on this. So lots of time. Now, what we kind of want to do is we'd want to set this up so it's automated. Now, what I don't want to do every year is go, okay, well, have to raise a review point because someone didn't change that to loss when it was a loss for the year or so on. So what we can do is we can create a cell for profit, we can create a cell for year, we can create a cell or we can actually create a condition to hide after taxation. If we wanted to amount to 761,739, we could also create a cell for this. We could create a cell for the currency because as you know, the currency is going to be driven by the presentation settings. So if I change this to $1, then that should change that to the dollar here. But obviously because I hard typed in the amount below, it's not going to update that 761,739 to have a dollar in front of it rather than a pound. So how do we do this? So let's start off with the balances. Okay, we'll work through those and we'll try and get as much of that done. And then what we'll probably do is we'll start looking at the if statement if you've got time. If not, we're going to be looking at the smart text next time. Okay, so within the advanced webinar, we'll look at if statements and how to drive that based upon the value in this cell or by your examples that you send through to us. Okay, perfect. All right, so first thing we need to do is we need to enter something called enable editing. Now you can see on my toolbar over here, we've got enable editing open. So accessible, so I'm going to type that in. Okay, so the password is the same on every Caseware file. You're saying that I can't type incorrectly. I did this the other day as well. All right, so sometimes I type that in and I still get it incorrect sometimes. What we want to do here is we want to create a cell, okay? So to create a cell, like the ones I showed you at the start of the webinar, what we want to do is go to insert, and on the left-hand side here, what we've got is our cell button. So you can see the shortcut for that is Control and L. So if you like shortcuts like me, then Control and L, and I'll open up this window for you, okay? Now, we'd always recommend that you start off with USX as the start of your cell number. I'm not going to go into all the details why, but simply if you use a cell reference that Caseware has already adopted, then rather than populating values that you can set up in calculations, what it will do is mimic Caseware's cell. Okay, so always start off with USX because Caseware won't use that. I'd always put in, say, RD there, so for results and dividends, and then just 1. Okay, so USX is a user-defined cell, RD is for the results and dividends section, and Y is because it's the first cell. So press OK, and then what we want here is I want to look at the currency or the amount. So we can do both of these. I can set the cell up now, but what we'll probably do, because it's on numeric, we'll just start off with the value, the profit figure. Okay, so we'll leave that as it is. The only thing I'm going to change here is the cell width. So as default, it's looking at exactly 1 inch over here. I'm going to change that to at least 0.1 of an inch. You can make it smaller, but just make it so you can at least see it. You don't want to make it so thin that you can't click into the cell. So I always start off with a 0.1 because as you can see, when that loads through, there we go. It's easy for me to see it. It's easy for me to click. Now, the trick here is if I go over to the next section, so where it says 162.177, if I press Control L here, it's going to give me the next increment on, so USX RD2. But what you'll see is it keeps that exact same cell properties. So if I go over here and I go to numeric, I can see that it's all the same. It doesn't mean it has to be the same. You can always change one. So I can make this one an input cell if I wanted to. So that will mimic a lot more what Caseware has done up here with the input area. So press OK. And then we can load those in. So how do we populate these? Okay, now this is the next step. You've got different options. What you could do and what I would recommend you to do would be to look at, say, populating it from a cell within the accounts. Maybe I would look to populate it from the income statement itself. So I'd go down to the statement of comprehensive income over here on the left hand side. And I'd go down here and say, okay, where's our profit figure? So there's profit before tax, and there's my profit for the financial year. So I'd want to link it to this cell here. Again, at the bottom here, you've also got the total comprehensive income for the year. So look at what, again, so for this bit here, I'd obviously not populate this area, so it makes no real difference to me. But you can just choose the cell you want. And then, so how do we know how to link it to this? There's a really useful button on the help section of the toolbar where you go into help. And on there, what we can see is not help, sorry, they've moved it to tools. So the old toolbar was in help. This one here is tech info. Okay. So if you're still using the old toolbar, go to help. If you're using the new one, like everyone should be by now, tech info here. Now, by clicking on tech info, what it will do is it will give you the cell reference. It'll also give you a cell calculation, which this one here is a little bit more in depth than what we'll be looking at. It's looking at right clicks. Again, we'll discuss that more in the next webinar. For this one, what I'm going to do is just link it to this cell here, so OC3.F25. So OC3.F25. So what we do is go back up to here, go back to cell, and go into the cell. So I'm just going to double click to go. So OC3.F25. Now, as soon as I type that cell reference in here, okay, which that cell reference is exactly the same cell reference as the one we created for our cell here, so USXRD1. You can see that value is now populated in. So I'm just going to copy this cheat a little bit. So that's 761739. Now, the reason why I'd link it down to the income statement is because you may apply rounding on the face of the income statement, rounding within areas. So if you're taking figures from the statement, so from figures from the balance sheet, where you would definitely be applying a rounding potentially, then at least we know that the rounding would also apply to the figure that we've linked to. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So I press OK. What we want to do then is go through and do the prior year. So at this stage here, you link the prior year slightly differently. Over here, I could double click on this cell again, or right click and go to edit cell. This one here, I was going to change, just remove this input cell, just makes it a little bit easier. And then from here, I can go to something called linkage. Now, we're going to go through this in more detail as well, because there's a lot of areas in here that could be useful. So we've got map numbers. So you can link it to map numbers. We can go through, look at account descriptions, account numbers. Now, what all of you who have mapped a trial balance in Caseware and used the assign mapping screen will be familiar with is something called net income. Okay, so net income is your profit and loss, and it's the determined value based upon all of your mapping. Okay, so where we map it, and that determines what that figure is. So we can see here we've got the 162,176. Okay, so at this stage here, I can click the plus icon, and if I move this out of the way, what you should see is that value now that's there. Now, the problem with this value is that when I've used the net income, it's got a bracket on it, and when I haven't used the net income over here, it hasn't got a bracket. So how do we fix that? Very easily. I'm just going to delete back the Caseware text. quickly first, but if I right click actually, and then you've got the option here when you show negative as. So if you've got a negative figure, so profit, we can just show negative as a positive, and then that will remove the brackets. It still obviously has the brackets in the background, but visually on the face of the document, it won't do. So let me just change this back now to standard full mode. And what we'll do is we'll delete the duplicate. So this 761 there, that's a duplicate. And then we've got the 162777, that's a duplicate. So the next one then quickly is how do we go through and how do we get this currency in there? How do this update? Now, again, what we can do is, and you can do this throughout the account, so it's very useful if you can't remember what it is go through to a table, look at the currency. So here's a dollar, and then again, tech info. And there we can see it just says CURRND, so current. So CURRND. So if I go up to the top now, and I go back to my results and dividends, and I could click create a new cell. So we'll go back into enable editing. When you go back into enable editing, it won't prompt you again to enter the password, which is a good thing, especially when you have trouble typing it in like I do. There we go. And we're just going to do Control and L, or actually let's use the insert option this time. And then USX RD3. Okay, brilliant. This time we're going to be looking at alphanumeric. And we are just going to, rather than going anywhere else, we can just type this right in here, ND. As soon as I type that in, you can see here that, well, we've got that dollar sign in there. It's populated exactly how we want it to, so we can press OK. And then what we can do is we can cheat a little bit over here. We know that this one here is that cell, so this cell reference is USX RD3. Get my words out or letters out. And then this time when I create it, what I can do, if I use that same cell reference, you can see here, it goes red. And so if we do use the same cell reference, it goes red. If I press OK, it'll say USX RD3 already exists. New cell will use the properties of the existing cell. So basically, if I continue the way I'm going now, what it's going to do is it's going to mimic that cell. And then I won't be able to change any of the other properties. You can see they're all grayed out. Okay, so basically all it's ever going to do is mimic this cell here. So if I change this cell, that's the only way this cell will change. Okay, right, so back out of view mode and just looking at the time. That should now be a little bit tidier. Now we can obviously do things for the year end as well. So for 2017. But what we're going to do is, just because of the time, I'm going to move over to having a look to an audit report. And for that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hand you over to Phil. Before we do though, just check with yourself, Phil. Are there any questions that have come in?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Again, not at this stage. If anyone does have any questions on any of the items that Tony's covered, then please feel free to raise your hand. There is still time, so please raise your hand at any point and we can ask a live question. Or again, put it in the question field and I can ask it on your behalf.
Brilliant. All right, guys, what I do is then, Phil, if you want to go through the demonstration of custom cells in the audit report, and then if there's any questions at the end, we'll answer them there. Brilliant. So I was going to give you control of those. So 2 seconds there, Phil. Okay, so you should be getting a notification now, Phil.
No. There we go. Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, if you can just close out the PowerPoint, please, Tony. There we go. Okay, guys. So I'm just going to run you through cell calculations within, in this case, a custom audit report. Now, The reason for this is something that we get a lot of calls on, especially on our support department, but also when we're out training. The custom audit report does come up quite often. Now, what we can see on the screen is just our standard audit report. So this is just the one that you would get on every single set of accounts if you just stick to the Caseware default. Now, what you'll notice is that things like the name of the company, the year-end dates, are all within cells. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that this can be populated across multiple files. So if you're using the same audit report across more than one entity, the idea is that it'll automatically update based on the file that you've inserted this set of accounts into, or sorry, this audit report into. Now, if I go over to the custom audit report, what you'll notice is that firstly that this audit report was created for a different entity. Now, what we would want to do is just insert cells and set up calculations to pick up the name of the entity automatically based on the file that we are in. So within the enable editing function, what we can do is we can insert cells and use the CLP codes that Tony mentioned earlier to pick up specific pieces of information. Now, if I click insert and I click insert a cell, now I've already seen this section. I'm going to call this USXRD3. I'm going to click OK, and cell type will put as alphanumeric. Now, we have already done a webinar on cell creation earlier last year. So what we'll do after the webinar as part of the Q&A document that we always release, we'll put a link to that webinar. So if you're unsure on any of the creation elements, then you can go back to that webinar. Now, in this case, we're going to create an alphanumeric cell, but what we can do is we can use the calculation properties to set up the calculation to pick up from a specific area. Now, the easiest way to do that is to use the three dots button on the right hand side. If I select that, we see the calculation editor, and within the variables option, we can use the engagement properties. Now, within the engagement properties section of the variables, you'll see a long list of CLP codes that are available. CLP2, for example, is one we're going to use. This is for the company name. Other ones, CLP3 can be used for the address first line, CLP4 for the address second line, etc. Now, the good thing about this is that that CLP code will always pick up, as Tony said, from the company name. So if I double click on that, that will automatically populate my calculation. You'll see I've got a result appearing there. Is Elstrom, because I've opened this custom audit report as part of the accounts, the CLP code will automatically pick up the name of the file that I'm in. So I can click OK, and again, you'll see within the calculated value, Elstrom Limited. Now, if I click OK, that will automatically insert that cell, and that will pick up the name of the entity. Now, the good thing about that is that regardless of the file I'm in, the name of the entity will automatically change. So I can apply this audit report. There we go. I can apply this audit report into other files, and again, it'll automatically pick up the name. We can also do this with dates. So where I've got the 31st of December 2019, I can again go to cell. This time I'm going to create a date cell. So I'm going to use date from the cell type. And again, we can use the three dots menu button, click on variables, and we can use again cell properties to pick up the date, the end date of the period. Now, the one that we need in this case is CLP13. So again, this will say on the right hand side, it will give you information about what this CLP code picks up. So in this case, CLP13. And don't worry too much about the result. It picks up the date as a number based on a period of time. But if I click OK to that, this is going to pull through as a date. Now, if I click OK, what you'll see is that pulls through as a short term date, or a short format date. So the day, a month, and year is all in short form. But what we can do within the properties, so if I return to the cell properties, I click on date and I can select long format, And again, you'll see within the sample options, the example of what this date will look like in your file. I can then remove the standard date that was already typed in. And that date will now automatically pick up, regardless of the file, again, that I've inserted this audit report into. Now, again, the good thing, and a lot like what Tony has already shown us, is that we can copy that cell number, or cell number that we've inserted, we can copy to pick up the same properties. So anywhere else that the year and date picks up in, I can use the cell button. I can give it the same cell number, so USX RD4. Click OK, say OK to retain the properties. And again, it's going to grey everything out because I can't change the properties from the cell I've already inserted. And I can click OK. And that will pick up the date in that cell. Now, if I go through, if I was to go back to the Caseware working papers and I went to engagement properties and just changed the name of the entity, so short form of limited, went back into my audit report, you'll see that's automatically changed it to the short form. Again, it'll be exactly the same for the date. So you can apply this audit report to multiple files if you want to. The other thing that you can build in, this is something that we'll cover within the second part of this webinar series, is just inserting checkboxes. So in most cases on your audit report, you're not going to have the material uncertainty relating to going concern and the conclusions related to going concern on the audit report. You'll have one or the other. And what we can do is we can insert checkboxes to control which area of this note is going to display. So if we go to cell, going to call this USX RD5, and I can go to checkbox. What you'll see is this automatically picks up as an input cell. Now I can go to the options here. I can have a look at the checkbox options. We tend to not change too many of these because we just want it to be a standard checkbox. The one thing you will want to do is just select to display only. Obviously, you don't want that printed on your accounts. You don't want a checkbox when you send it off to your client to sign. If I click OK, that will create the checkbox. Now, what we'll do, what you'll be able to do is use that checkbox to control which areas of the audit report show in which circumstance. Now, that will be covered in our advanced level webinar. So we'll look at inserting sections and using those sections to print or hide a section based on whether you've selected that checkbox. For now, what I'll do is I'll pass you back to Tony. We'll just see if we've got any questions at all.
Right, Phil, we have had one question come in. I've had one question on my side. It's saying, can we have multiple custom audit reports within a file? Because we've got varying auditors from KPMG to PwC, and it'd be useful to have more than one. Is that possible to include those in there?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Yes, you can create as many custom audit reports as you want. Or if you really wanted to get technical, you could build one audit report and then use the checkboxes that we created to turn sections on, turn sections off based on the set of accounts that you're doing, who the auditor is. If they're if they're completely different, I would probably recommend that you create two separate audit reports just because it's a lot easier to manage. Okay. But yeah, so when in the second or in the advanced webinar, we'll show you how to insert the checkboxes. So you can, in theory, just have one main audit report and hide and show sections. Just Super. On the questions, Tony. We have a quick question in regarding, I believe this is regarding the calculation that you've inserted in the director's report, and that is to do with, if you go back into your director's report.
Okay, so that's over now. Source evidence.
So just regarding the prior year, what possible cause would it be that the figure's different from the standard Caseware one?
Okay, so this 1662177. It all comes down to rounding in the accounts. So I don't know if you remember at the start, one of the points I raised was that you try and link it from the statements within the accounts, rather than linking it to, say, map numbers or, say, to the accounts with the net income. If we went down to statement of comprehensive income and go down the bottom here, what you see is that is 162,177. And then if I go back up at the top, it's 162,777. So that matches what Caseware's got. And you can see there's a 1 unit rounding in it. Unfortunately, due to the complex nature of the calculations that go into building the statements and the notes, the way things round is not as straightforward and as clear as what we may think it is, just due to the nature of the calculations. So what I'd say is, if you're trying to link this and you're going to link it to the net income, like I've done there, yet you still want to make sure it easily roundable. Remember what we could do in enable editing is just have that set up. So we can change it to an input cell, like Phil showed you there for the checkbox. So we could change this to an input cell by right-click, edit, and then tick the input cell there, OK. And then that way you can just quickly manually update it for any rounding that may affect your file, which generally, if we're using decimal numbers on the TB, you're always going to see those little things pop up. What would stop that from happening as often would be just to remove those decimal numbers from the trial balance, because I don't think anyone probably on the webinar today discloses with decimal numbers on the face of the accounts. So it's information though that we don't really need on the face of the TB. Okay, hope that helps with that one.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And if anyone else has any questions at all, that was the only question we had at this point, then feel free to raise hands or chuck the question in the questions field. We'll just give you a second.
Okay, whilst we're giving you a second to do that, just to let you guys know as well, the loads of past webinars are on the knowledge base. Everything that we publish, every webinar we record and have live, it all gets recorded and put onto the knowledge base. They're all accessible for all of you to go back and look at any of them. There's a mountain of content there, so please feel free to go back over old ones. If you think your colleagues would find it useful, maybe send the link to them. Also, we have got some upcoming webinars, which I'm not going to read off for the ones on the screen. You guys can see them a lot better than read them a lot quicker than I can. But there's the 17th of July one there, which will be the cell calculations, which will be the advanced cell calculations webinar. So again, if you do want to see content specifics, like say custom text notes and so on, and that smart text that we mentioned earlier, then please feel free to put that in the question field, because we'd really like to incorporate them into the webinars and make them as useful as possible for you. So with saying that, that's all I've got to cover from Caseware's aspect. So is there any more questions that have popped in at all, Phil?
Not at this stage. As always, we will release a feedback form after the webinar. So if anyone does have any questions, any items that they want to add, or any feedback on future webinars, then feel free to include those in the feedback form. Also, any areas you want us to cover specifically within the cell calculation advanced webinar.
Brilliant. All right, thanks everyone for turning up. Everyone is joining today. Thanks, Phil, for the presentation, and I think that's probably all we've got time for today. So have a good afternoon and have a lovely weekend.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.